Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of popular culture in the Great Depression. And in this lecture, we're going to focus on literature and the arts. Typically, when we talk about the New Deal, we focus on its economic programs and kind of intervention into American society. But it also funded many programs that cultivated and supported cultural projects. And it played an important role in the popular culture of the Depression era. In part, in supporting those kind of projects, it made available to the American public many elements of culture that they might not otherwise have access to. It supported the employment opportunities, the stereotype of the starving artist or the starving writer or starving musician was more than a stereotype at this time. Many of those folks were out of work, much as a normal factory worker might be. So they needed work, and the New Deal helped to support them. And also, many of those programs were designed to creating a historical record of what was going on during the Depression era. So when we think about the photography project and some of the historical projects, recording projects, those have become very important for historians and scholars of this era because they've preserved the historical record itself. So the New Deal was really important in the arts in the Depression era. The first New Deal program dedicated to this process was the Public Works of Art Project, the PWAP, which ran from December 1933 to June 1934. This was part of the first New Deal, which, as I've described previously, was more oriented toward resolving the emergency of the first New Deal. It was designed to putting people back to work and getting the economy back on track. So a cultural program like the Public Works of Art Project had not really caught on quite yet. Nonetheless, one of the elements of this project was to put artists to work painting public buildings and in some cases creating some of the murals on the walls and street sides of America, some of which still exist today. With the Work Progress Administration of 1935 and the advent of the Second New Deal, there was much more federal funding and support and also national support for programs dedicated to the arts. And the Federal Art Project of the Second New Deal represents this aim. It supported funding for artists of many different walks of life, creating murals, paintings, sculptures, graphic arts, posters, photography, and many other aspects as well. This project helped to employ more than 10,000 artists and craft workers during this period of the Depression. It also created 100 or more community art centers which conducted all kinds of local projects related to the arts. And ultimately, the section of painting and sculpture was created to commission high-quality murals on public buildings. So again, this created a lasting artistic and public record of the works of this project. Also falling under the umbrella of the WPA was the Federal Writers Project, the Federal Theater Project, the Federal Music Project, and the Photography Project, and others, which helped to put to work artists in all of these various realms, either on their own projects or federally created projects to put them to work. As one example, writers were put to work creating what was known as the State Guide Series, which was a series of guidebooks for every state. And so those would require photographers to photograph things and also writers to document the various aspects of the state that would go into those guidebooks. Writers and historians were also hired to collect the stories of former slaves, and we have many oral histories and recordings of some of those who had survived from the era of slavery. Also recording folk songs and folk stories, and developing archival collections of many different sorts. One interesting element of these sorts of projects is that the artists employed by the federal government didn't necessarily create works of art that might have been flattering to the government or the nation itself. Many of the works provided critiques of the way the government operated, or big business, or other things. Lots of them, of course, documented the various miseries created by the Depression itself. And in other cases, like the Farm Security Administration, which took photographs across the American West, I've talked earlier about Dorothea Lange and some of her photographs. They provide a record that preserves in time this very harsh and difficult period in American history. So the New Deal supported and funded these artists, but was not interested in censoring them or limiting their artistic production. Perhaps with some qualification of that in the most extreme cases. But for the most part, these artists were allowed to produce the kind of art that they wanted to and were inspired to do. Many of the themes we've discussed already were reflected in the comic strips and budding comic books of this era, including some of the most popular titles like Little Orphan Andy, Popeye, and Superman. And Little Orphan Annie was one that thrived throughout the Great Depression. Little Orphan Annie launched in 1924. And actually, the comic ran through 2010. It had more than an 80-year run. But it also vaulted in popularity in 1930 with the onset of the Great Depression. It was in that year that Little Orphan Annie also became a syndicated radio program, which for stretches rivaled the Lone Ranger in popularity and deployed similar methods as the Lone Ranger. There were clubs, there was merchandise and paraphernalia that would be sent out to fans all around the country. But the storyline of Little Orphan Annie is really what gripped the nation. She is an impoverished orphan who is adopted by Daddy Warbucks and suddenly welcomed into a life of unimaginable riches and opportunity. Now, of course, over the decades, the storyline would rise and fall. Daddy Warbucks lost his fortune several different times. Nonetheless, it represented to the nation the idea that even those who were the most down on their luck might find riches and success in the depths of the Great Depression. Another favorite character of the 1930s was Popeye the Sailor Man, who appeared in his own cartoon series in 1933 after being a character in some other series in the years before that. On the one hand, Popeye represents the everyman, and maybe even more telling, his friend Wimpy, whose famous line, "I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today," reflected how many Americans felt in the Great Depression. They may not have been able to afford a hamburger today, but surely by Tuesday something would come through. And so there is an everyman quality of Popeye the Sailor Man involved in this sort of awkward love triangle with Olive Oyl, his love interest, and Bluto, the sort of comic villain. But there is also the superhuman quality of Popeye. When he eats spinach, he gains super strength. And over the course of his many adventures, Popeye took Americans in their mind's eye to locations all around the world. And so he represents not only the kind of struggles of all of us, but also this kind of superhuman quality. And like the others that I've mentioned, Popeye spawned movie sequels, radio serials, and all manner of merchandise and paraphernalia. The other comic figure that I would mention is Superman. I've already talked about the advent of the Superman comics, but again, it really reflects the need and desire for Americans in this era to have heroes. This kind of desperate call for someone to come in and save us. And at the same time, like I mentioned with Popeye, there is an adventurous quality to the Superman comics that allows Americans to see different places, to even go to different planets and just do things by reading these comic books that they could never do in reality in their own lives. In the more traditional sense, American writers produced some great works of literature during the Depression era. And perhaps no one represents that era more fittingly than John Steinbeck, who wrote some of the classics of the era, including The Grapes of Wrath and Of Mice and Men. And his writing reflects the view shared by many writers of the time, providing a sort of social criticism of life during the Depression years and the struggles of regular working class Americans. That kind of frustration took another form in this era, in the form of what came to be known as the Lost Generation, a group of disenchanted writers and actors and other performers who actually left the country for a time or permanently, many of them relocating to Paris, in which they found an artistic haven. The phrase was credited to Gertrude Stein, but popularized by Ernest Hemingway, who used the phrase in his novel The Sun Also Rises. Gertrude Stein was among the first American writers to relocate to Paris and established an artist haven there where other writers could come and spend time, including Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, and others. The idea of the Lost Generation originates with World War I. Some of these writers served in World War I, but they all lived through that era. And there's a sense of frustration and disenchantment that evolves out of the war. And then some of these writers grow equally frustrated with the laziness and consumption of the 20s. And F. Scott Fitzgerald, certainly one of those who represents that kind of frustration. His masterwork, The Great Gatsby, reflects the kind of emptiness that comes with the excessive consumption of the 20s. A final example of this so-called lost generation was Josephine Baker. Baker was born and raised in St. Louis and grew up largely in poverty, struggling to make ends meet. Eventually, as a teenager, she caught on in vaudeville and finally moved to New York. She found performing in vaudeville she was able to make a good living and was considered, during the end of her stay in New York, one of the top performers in vaudeville. But her act was mostly comedic. She often performed in blackface and was made to kind of dance around sillily at the end of the dancing line. And she knew that her talents were better than that. In 1925, she sailed for Paris on what was intended to be a short trip, and it ended up becoming her home, and she remained there for most of the rest of her life and certainly considered it home. In Paris, she became one of the top performers in the world, best known for her erotic dances and the mystery and beauty that she portrayed on the stage. But in Paris and her travels throughout Europe and the rest of the world, she found that she wasn't met with the same kind of racism and belittling treatment that she had encountered in the United States. So, for Josephine Baker, it took leaving the country to really find the full measure of her success, and many other writers and performers encountered that same kind of challenge. In the next lectures about popular culture in the Depression years, we will turn to another realm, the realm of sports.